Hey guys, how's it going? Sam here. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be looking at my first impressions of the piece of software called Paintstorm and if I think it's a good viable alternative to Photoshop for professional work. I'll also be showing my painting process for this piece you can see here, talking about how I create a portrait and what led me to produce this image. With that, let's get into it. So I would like to start just by talking a little bit about this painting and why I chose to create it. So for me, sometimes when inspiration strikes, I just have to produce an image, and it definitely happened with this one. Something I'd like to talk about really quickly is preparation for an image and sometimes how that can bog you down. It does me. So with this image, I thought, well, I want to create a portrait and I want to do it entirely using reds. So my concept is I can do portraits in every different colour. So this is the red one, I'd have blue, yellow, green. So I'm challenging myself to use different colours and how I can create unconventional portraits. Now normally, sometimes with pieces I spend an hour or a couple of hours finding good reference images or taking photos and trying to work out the best way to tackle the process and the style I want to produce it in. And by the time I found all the reference images, I don't want to do it anymore. I'm tired or I feel uninspired. So the initial inspiration kind of goes away. Obviously with professional work, you just have to get on with it. But when it's your own personal piece, sometimes you're like, nah, I'll do it another day, and then I never get around to it. So with this piece, I was very conscious of that, and I wanted to start really quickly. So within 10 minutes of having the concept of I'm going to do a portrait in red, I started painting. Now with this piece, I didn't have any reference for the model, so it's entirely imaginary. The only thing I found reference images for the nose, the mouth and the eyes. So I knew kind of the facial structure. It basically required me to entirely produce the lighting because obviously the lighting was different on each of those images. So I don't produce portraits too often, so sometimes at the start of these portraits I fumble around trying to find the right values or the right colour, and this piece is no different. The first half of the way I create portraits, they always look absolutely terrible, and then all of a sudden they kind of come to life. And I think that's something I probably need to work on. I need to establish the facial forms very quickly. So I won't go too much into how I produced the portrait today because that will be a video in and of itself. But what I would say is try to imagine your 2D art as 3D representations. With portraits, I try to imagine I'm creating them out of clay and I'm carving the values. Try to imagine using clay to add the form of a nose. How would that look and how would light affect that from the angle that you have it? So with this piece, obviously it being really front on, that's a little easier. So if you're struggling with portraits, create a portrait like this where it's completely front on and choose a directional light source and try to understand how those car shadows would be created. You'll tend to find if the light's coming from above, your brow bone sticks out further, so it's going to be lighter because it's coming towards the camera, and the eye sockets recede, so they're going to be darker. If you take that simple methodology of trying to create them in clay, it's a great way of starting a painting, and then by understanding light you can start to refine it. So I wanted to create a portrait entirely front on because I wanted to see how dynamic I could make the image without using an interesting pose. So if I had the face turning away or a slight angle, it would have been slightly more dynamic and easier to achieve. So I wanted to see what I could do with just a lighting source to make it interesting. And I think that was relatively successful. I don't love this painting, but I do think it was good for me to try and has definitely given me some ideas about what I want to try next. So one thing I would say, I actually prefer this painting kind of halfway through, just after I add the blue to the eyes. I think the piece really pops and I like the simple brushstrokes to define the form. And as I continue painting, I add more and more contrasting values, which almost flattens the image to a certain extent. I am quite happy with the overall image. To a certain extent, I really like not having any brushstrokes in the background as well. I wanted to try and make it look almost like a traditional painting. So by adding brushstrokes in the background to soften some of the edges, that was the concept. But I actually kind of like the hard edges around the entire form, makes it more graphic. which with a front-on pose I think works really well. So that's something I might go back to. I might cut out the image and see how it looks. But it's not really much of a portfolio piece. It was more just for me to try out new techniques and try out this new piece of software. So I think that's probably enough about the painting. What I really want to talk about today is the piece of software Paintstorm Studio, and why I wanted to use it and why I didn't work in Photoshop. So I've been using Photoshop for over 10 years. It's become my main workhorse day to day. I use it pretty much every single day. I use it for every professional piece I make, and I think it's very dependable, and I'm so used to using it. I have techniques that I use that can only really be used in Photoshop. I have all my shortcuts set up, but I do have some annoyances with Photoshop. So I don't think the brushes are that great for blending. They can't mimic traditional painting processes particularly well, the way other pieces of software can. And I do find it to be quite buggy and quite glitchy. It has specific glitches in Photoshop that sometimes just keep coming back, especially on Windows, that really bug me. And it's caused me lately to not want to paint in Photoshop. So I've had Paintstorm for years. I bought it a couple of years ago and it's really cheap. I'm not sure how expensive it is now, but when I bought it, it was something like £13, £15 in the UK. So if you can't afford Photoshop, it's definitely worth looking into. To give you a little bit of an understanding, I haven't used this painting software much, so I'm definitely not the authority on it. So if you're interested, definitely give it a Google, see if anyone else has used it that you like. But what I will say its strengths, it's really good at mimicking traditional paint, and that's what it's based in. It is a digital painter's toolkit, whereas Photoshop was designed for photo editing, and digital artists use it and manipulate the software to achieve what they want to achieve, but it wasn't created for that, and it still isn't. They have tried to accommodate for digital artists, but still it's an all-round piece of software, whereas something like Paintstorm or Painter or Clip Studio, like all these other pieces of software, they are designed for digital artists to create digital content. And I think in certain regards it does show. So with Paintstorm, as you can see with this painting, I think it's really good at blending brushes. Now I use one brush because I didn't want to get bogged down in trying to use too many different brushes and get lost in the software. I wanted to use one brush and not change any of the settings and just see what I could create. And I have to say it was so much fun painting this software. It's really inspired me to produce more images. And it's great for emulating traditional medium. So I think if you like the digital paintings that look like real paintings, like oil paint or acrylic, then this definitely might be worth investigating. The tool set, like I said, I haven't used much of it. I haven't dove in too much with working out how comprehensive the piece of software is, but it seems great. The adjustments to the brushes are brilliant. You can see them down the left-hand side, the amount of settings you have. Changing your workspace is really great. You can change all the colors, you can change the layout, you can change where everything sits, as well as adding interesting things like the mixer palette. Imagine a traditional palette where the paints actually start to blend together to find new colors. I think works really well. The color palette, by default, I do like more in this piece of software than Photoshop. So I think for a traditional painter, if you're just using limited layers, you don't use too many varied techniques specialized in Photoshop, and you just want to throw paint on a page to create your pieces, this might be a really good viable alternative. Now, as I mentioned, my process, I rely on certain techniques in Photoshop. So will this replace Photoshop for me for professional work? I think the answer currently is no, because, as I said, because it's not even this software's fault. Because I've been using Photoshop for so long, I'm just so used to it. I know where everything is, I know my shortcuts, and as soon as you go into a new piece of software, everything slows down, everything takes longer to achieve. So that's something worth bearing in mind. If you've used Photoshop for years and years, when you go into a new piece of software, you'll probably find it frustrating. I certainly do. So as an example, I've mentioned in previous videos, I use blend modes in the layer options in Photoshop to add color layers and then blend different layers together. As far as I know, Paintstorm doesn't have that feature, and that's something I use in almost every painting. So it almost makes it impossible for me to use this piece of software when such a big technique is used in my process. Now, of course, I don't need it. I don't have to use that process, but for professional work, you want the fastest approach possible. Now, I know that is a fast approach, so I'm going to want to use that. So for professional work, could I go into Photoshop first, do those techniques, then bring it into this software? Potentially. And I might consider doing that because I do think the brushes are much better in this piece of software. So if I can finish paintings in this software, then that might be a good resolution. So one thing I will say, I have quite a powerful machine, and when this image was first set to a high resolution, the brushes were lagging. Now, I don't know if that's settings. As far as I could tell, I couldn't adjust any settings as far as how to adjust the scratch disk or how much RAM to use like you can in Photoshop. I couldn't tell how to do that. So those kind of settings are definitely lacking. I mean, it's entirely possible I just couldn't find them, and they do exist. So I apologize if that is the case, but as far as I could tell, that it wasn't. And it does lag a little. So the file sizes, there do seem to be restrictions. And that was definitely the case when I had experience using Painter as well. Because of the way the brushes have texture and the way they blend, that's process heavy, so it's going to lag on your computer. And I create some pieces for commercial clients that need to be huge because they're printed really large, and I couldn't use this piece of software for those pieces if I'm using textured brushes. It's just not possible unless I spend a couple of grand on a new computer. So that's something to bear in mind. I think for general use for most people, it'll be absolutely fine. In this painting, I'm working at maybe 3000 pixels squared. So kind of like I would say that's a medium resolution. Normally I'd work a little bit higher and then shrink the final JPEG down. But it, for this piece, worked absolutely fine. One thing I would say to bear in mind with this piece of software is not many people use it. Maybe that's growing, maybe that will change in the future, but currently if you want to problem solve and you want to have an online community that will address problems, there just aren't as many people doing it. So if you Google how to install Photoshop brushes, there are millions of YouTube videos and links and forum updates, whereas with this piece of software there won't be. So that's something to bear in mind. If you want help, you might have to contact the creators themselves or work it out yourself. Sometimes with pieces of software that aren't as common, not having an online community to rely on sometimes can be a hindrance. Photoshop, like it or not, is the industry standard. So if you want to be a concept artist in a studio, you're going to want to know how to use Photoshop. That would be the first thing they want you to use. It's pretty hard going into a studio and saying, by the way, I don't use that piece of software, can you install this for me? Because they might not be willing to do that, and then you're going to be in trouble. Or they might install it for you, but it might look bad. They might have worries about implementing that. I know most softwares export in PSDs, but still there might be some weird glitches between the two pieces of software, and art directors do not want that as a hassle. So most studios are going to use Photoshop. If you're just starting out, I do recommend you learn Photoshop, even if it's just the basics. If you end up in a studio environment where they use Photoshop, I'd recommend you learn it. So my final conclusions, will I use this painting process again? Yes, absolutely. I think it's great for these kind of paintings where they're more gestural, more painterly pieces. I definitely will. Will it replace Photoshop for me? Currently, no. There are tools and settings I use in Photoshop that I use daily that for client work I have to rely on. Especially as a concept artist, it's all about speed, and if I know I can do something faster in a different piece of software, there's no reason for me not to use that. So day to day I will be using Photoshop, and if this piece of software keeps improving, then amazing, I'll keep using it. And as I said, I will keep using this painting software for new pieces that are more gestural, more painterly, where I think the brushstrokes are really important. It's really fun to work in, so I definitely want to use it more. And maybe I'll develop a new process that will be better in this software. So I know a lot of you in the comments are going to have your own pieces of software that you use. I would love to hear what they are, and I can't promise I'll use them, but it's definitely great for everyone in the comments to know, especially with Photoshop being a month-by-month cost. It can be very expensive. It's hard to justify sometimes, so these cheaper pieces of software are going to be used more. So I thought I'd share my initial thoughts on this software. I will be using it more, so I might have update videos and I'll let you know how it goes. So that is it, guys. That was just my initial thoughts. Hopefully this has been useful. Once again, I would just really like to thank everyone who has subscribed to my content and has been watching and commenting. It's taken off over the last month, and I know it's still a small channel, but it really has grown. So I'd just like to thank everyone. You're the reason I'm creating this content, and I feel very privileged that you guys are watching and wanting to see more. So if you have ideas for future content, put a comment down. Don't feel afraid to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will catch you in the next video.